Every Thursday morning for 51 years, a man named Harold Jennings in Detroit, Michigan, sat at his kitchen table before anyone else in the house was awake and did the same thing. He wrote one sentence in a small spiral notebook. Not a journal entry, not a prayer, not a grocery list. One sentence. It had started in 1973 after a conversation with a therapist he had seen for 8 months following his discharge from Vietnam. A therapist who had told him that men who carry things they cannot name often benefit from finding some shape for the carrying. Harold had tried full journal entries. They felt like too much. He had landed on one sentence. Some of them were mundane. Some of them were the truest things he had ever produced. He filled 11 notebooks over 51 years. In the final notebook, on a Thursday in April, 2 weeks before the Family Feud taping, the sentence read, "I have spent my whole life feeling like I started in the middle of a story I was never given the beginning of." On the afternoon, Steve Harvey stood at the center of the Family Feud stage and said, "Harold, the man standing across from you has been writing the same sentence in his own notebook for 40 years. Harold Jennings, 72 years old, Korean and Vietnam veteran, retired auto worker, grandfather of 4, looked across 14 feet of studio floor at a man named Calvin Ross and understood. In the specific way that the body understands things before the mind does, that the beginning of the story had just walked into the room. It was a Wednesday in June, taping day at ImageWorks Studios in Atlanta. Harold Jennings had come from Detroit with his daughter Patricia, her husband Sam, his grandson Marcus, 22, who had driven the whole way and refused to let anyone else take a turn, and Harold's oldest friend, a man named Elwood, who had known Harold since 1969 and who had been told in the car that this was a fun family trip, which Elwood had accepted because at 73 he had learned to accept the description of things rather than interrogate them. Harold was 72. He was a large, quiet man who moved through rooms with the specific economy of someone who has learned not to waste anything. Not words, not steps, not attention. He had worked the assembly line at a Ford plant in Dearborn for 31 years. He had raised 3 children. He had buried his wife, Carolyn, in 2019, and had been learning ever since how to inhabit a house alone, which was a skill set he had not anticipated needing and was developing with the same patient methodology he brought to everything. Patricia had submitted the Family Feud application in January. She had done it, she told the casting team, because her father needed something to look forward to. She had not been wrong about this. She had also not known, when she submitted it, that the production team would spend the following 10 weeks doing something that would change everything. Calvin Ross, 72, lived in Columbus, Ohio. He had been a high school history teacher for 33 years, a deacon at his church for 22, and a grandfather of 3. He was also a quiet man. His family described him as a man who listened more than he spoke, and who, when he did speak, said things worth the wait. He had been adopted at 6 weeks old by a family in Columbus, and had grown up knowing he was adopted, knowing that his biological origins were undocumented, and carrying a feeling he had never been able to articulate except to say, when pressed, that he felt like a chapter that had been separated from its book. He had started writing in a notebook at 32. His wife Dora had given him the first one for his birthday. He wrote one sentence every Thursday morning. He had filled 9 notebooks. In the final one, 2 weeks before the taping, his Thursday sentence had read, "Somewhere there is a person who knows the first part of what I am." The DNA match had come through a genealogical database in February. A sibling match of 49.9% between Harold Jennings and Calvin Ross. The database had flagged it as a full sibling match with extremely high confidence. A researcher at the database had contacted Calvin first, then Harold's daughter Patricia, through the application she had submitted. Patricia had sat down on her kitchen floor and stayed there for 20 minutes. Then she had called the Family Feud production team. Harold did not know. Calvin did not know. They had been told they were coming to tape a game show. Both of them had believed this, because people tend to believe the ordinary explanation when the extraordinary one has not yet been offered. The producers had spent 6 weeks verifying the match, obtaining secondary confirmation through a separate laboratory, consulting with a family counselor about the appropriate disclosure protocol, and briefing Steve Harvey, who had taken the call on a Tuesday morning, listened without speaking for 9 minutes, and then said, quietly, "I need to sit with this for a moment." He had spent 40 minutes alone before beginning production prep. Both families had been playing Family Feud for 3 full rounds. 3 rounds of a game show, side by side. 72-year-old men who had been separated 6 weeks after birth, and who had spent 72 years carrying the same feeling in different cities. The cameras had caught it. In the footage reviewed afterward, Harold watching Calvin's answers with the specific quality of attention that is different from competitive assessment. Calvin glancing at Harold between questions with a frequency that his son, watching the broadcast later, said he had never seen his father direct at a stranger. Something in the room had been recognizing something before anyone in the room knew what it was. But the real story hadn't even started yet. Between rounds 3 and 4, Steve Harvey walked to the center of the stage. He stood there for a moment without speaking. The audience, which had been reading the room all morning with the collective instinct of 300 people who watch a great deal of television, went quiet. Steve looked at Harold. He said, "Harold, can I ask you something?" Harold said yes. Steve said, "Have you ever felt like you were missing something? Not something you lost, something you never had." Harold was quiet for 7 seconds. The 7 seconds were visible. Then he said, "My whole life. Like I started in the middle of a story I was never given the beginning of. The audience was completely still." Steve Harvey pressed his fist to his mouth. He looked at the floor for a moment. Then he looked at Calvin Ross. He said, "Calvin, the man standing across from you has been writing one sentence in a notebook every Thursday morning for 51 years. I'm going to tell you what this morning's sentence was." He read it. He read it slowly and clearly, and the studio absorbed it the way rooms absorb things that are true and large and have been a long time arriving. Then he said, "Calvin, Harold is your brother. You were born together 72 years ago in a hospital in Detroit. You were placed for separate adoptions at 6 weeks old. You have been alive at the same time for 72 years, and this is the first time you have ever been in the same room." Harold Jennings made no sound for 8 seconds. Then he said, very quietly, "Say that again." Steve Harvey said it again. Harold turned toward Calvin Ross. Calvin Ross was already turned toward Harold. 72 years old. The same height. The same wide, quiet face. The same way of holding the shoulders, slightly forward, as if perpetually prepared to lift something. They looked at each other across 14 feet of a game show stage, and the room held completely still. Calvin Ross said, in a voice that was barely a voice at all, "You feel like me." Harold said, "I know." And then Harold Jennings, 72 years old, who had learned not to waste anything, crossed the 14 feet in 8 steps and put his arms around his brother for the first time in their shared lives, and made a sound that was not a word and did not need to be. Steve Harvey could not stop crying. This was the thing the clip's 390 million viewers would note most. Not a moment of tears and recovery, not a television pause with a composed return. Steve Harvey cried for 4 minutes and 12 seconds, measured from the moment Harold crossed the stage. He sat on the floor at the 9-second mark. He stood at the 2-minute mark and sat back down at the 2-minute 30 mark. He pressed his handkerchief to his face and lowered it, and pressed it again. He made no attempt to manage any of it. His makeup artist appeared from the edge of the stage at the 3-minute mark, and Steve waved her away, gently, without looking at her. He said, between moments, to no one in particular, "I can't." He said it 4 times. He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. The audience was completely still for the full 4 minutes. When Steve Harvey stood for the final time, his face was what it was, and he did not cover it, and he spoke directly to the cameras and said, "I have been on television for 30 years. I have been on this show for 23 years. I have never, in any room, in any studio, on any stage, been in the presence of something like this." He stopped. He waited. These 2 men were born together. They were separated 6 weeks later. They spent 72 years carrying the same feeling in different cities. They have been writing the same sentence for decades. He looked at Harold and Calvin, who were still standing together at the center of the stage. And the first time they ever met, they were competing against each other on a game show, which is either the most absurd thing that has ever happened on this program, or the most perfectly designed thing the universe has ever arranged. I haven't decided which. He pulled out his phone. He called a genealogical legal services specialist, a firm he had worked with on 2 previous reunion cases, and arranged, on the stage floor, for a complete documentation of Harold and Calvin's shared biological history, birth records, adoption placement files, biological parent research, and a formal certification of twin birth that would give both men a legal and historical document confirming what the Dina and the room had already told them. He covered all costs directly. He said, "These men deserve to know their whole story. Every page of it." He called the counseling service he had worked with on previous reunions. He arranged 4 facilitated sessions for Harold and Calvin and their families, understanding that 72 years of separate lives, separate families, and separate identities create a reunion that requires more than a single moment, however large that moment is. He announced both families would receive the full day's prize. He looked at Elwood, Harold's friend of 53 years, who had come on what he had been told was a fun family trip, and who was, now sitting in the 3rd position of Harold's team with his hands folded, on the podium and his face doing the thing that faces do when 70. 3 years of life suddenly reveal themselves to have been, building toward a single afternoon. Steve said, "Sir, how long have you known Harold?" Elwood said, 53 years. Steve said, "Did you know?" Elwood said, "Nobody knew." He paused. "But I always thought Harold was looking for something." The episode aired 9 weeks later in a 2-part format the network approved in a meeting that took 11 minutes. The clip reached 390 million views in 15 days, the second most viewed clip in the show's history. The hashtag "the beginning of the story" was used in 68 countries. The Oxford Dictionary of Quotations received 3 separate nominations to include Harold Jennings's Thursday sentence, which the selection committee ultimately accepted in the following year's edition. 3 months after the taping, Harold Jennings and Calvin Ross had spoken by phone 63 times. They had visited each other twice, once in Detroit, once in Columbus. Harold had brought his notebooks. Calvin had brought his. They had read some of the Thursday sentences aloud to each other. Calvin's wife Dora had sat at the kitchen table during the Columbus visit and listened, and said afterward that it was the most unusual and most moving thing she had witnessed in 41 years of marriage. Harold's daughter Patricia had cried for the entirety of the Detroit visit and was unapologetic about it. A year after the taping, Harold and Calvin had attended 3 family events together: a graduation, a birthday party, and one Sunday dinner in Columbus that had begun at 2 in the afternoon and ended at 9 at night, because neither family had been able to identify the appropriate moment to leave. Their combined grandchildren, 7 in total, had needed approximately 45 minutes to incorporate the existence of one another, and had spent the remaining hours behaving as if they had always been cousins, because in fact they had always been cousins. Harold Jennings has continued his Thursday sentence practice. The Thursday after the taping, his sentence read, "The beginning of the story was in Columbus the whole time." Calvin Ross wrote the same sentence on the same Thursday in his own notebook without knowing what Harold had written. They discovered this during the Detroit visit when Patricia, who had read both notebooks with the specific thoroughness of a woman who does not miss things, pointed it out. Both men were quiet for a while. Then Harold said, 51 years of notebooks, and that's the only sentence we ever wrote the same way." Calvin said, "That's enough." Steve Harvey, in an interview 6 months after the episode aired, was asked what had made him cry for 4 minutes and 12 seconds on a game show stage. He said, "Because it was the first time in 30 years of television that I was in a room where the thing that was supposed to be impossible had simply decided to happen anyway, and I realized I didn't have anything useful to say. So I just sat down on the floor and let it be true." He paused. That's the right response to some things. You just get out of the way and let it be true. If this incredible story of 2 brothers, 72 years and 51 notebooks touched your heart, subscribe to this channel and hit the like button. Share this with someone who believes it is never too late to find your family or the beginning of your story. Have you ever found a piece of yourself you didn't know was missing? Share your story in the comments, because as Harold and Calvin proved, the sentence you've been writing your whole life sometimes turns out to be addressed to someone you haven't met yet.